So you've done the work. You've built a business, you've built a life, you've checked the boxes that were supposed to mean peace, but underneath it all, something still feels off. You feel tense even when everything looks fine. You second guess your intuition, even when you know you're right. Your mind races when you're supposed to be resting. And it's not that you're not successful. It's that success without alignment still feels like pressure. And performance without presence leaves you empty. And this isn't about burnout. It's about the gap that exists between the version of you that the world sees and the one that's inside of you that's quietly asking, is this all there is? I'm Chuck Downs. I coach entrepreneurs and advisors who have built success but still feel like something's missing. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through 5 shifts that will bring you back to the version of you who leads with peace, moves with purpose, and never questions their self-worth. Now, shift 1 is awareness. And that's really where the return begins. It doesn't happen without doing. It's not without fixing, but it's with this. It's with awareness. You know, most people live inside stories that they didn't even write. They wake up in reaction. They react to the calendar. They react to the inbox. They react to thoughts that they have been rehearsing for years. And those thoughts, they may sound like you, but they're not you. You know, they sound like, I always seem to mess this up. They don't respect me. I have to do it all. They're just echoes. They're scripts that got memorized by your nervous system and replaced enough times so that they become to feel like your identity. I had a client recently that I started working with and has been wildly successful, but was constantly stressed. And every time she sat still, her thoughts would ramp up. You should be doing more. Don't get lazy now. And that wasn't her drive. It was her fear disguised as discipline. And that's what had been running this show for decades. And so here's the shift. You're not overthinking, you're over-remembering. When you slow down enough to observe the thought instead of becoming the thought, you create space. And in that space, you return to choice. You know, awareness isn't passive, it's power. Because you can't shift what you're still owning. Now, shift 2 is emotional mastery. So once you can see the thought clearly, the next step is to notice what's fueling it. Because the thought is just the surface. What lives underneath is emotion. And that's where we go next. Most of us, we were never taught how to feel, we were taught how to function. So we suppress, we spin, we shut it down, or we make it everything. But emotional mastery isn't about control. It's about presence. I remember a moment a few years ago, a corporate client that had said yes backed out of a big deal. And it was no explanation, it was no drama, it was just distance. And instantly my mind filled in the gaps. What did I miss? What did I do wrong? How did I mess this up? But instead of spinning it or continuing to spin it, I just sat still and I reflected. And I asked myself, what's actually here? Not the story, not the judgment, just the feeling. And what came up was honest. It was disappointment. It was grief. It was fear. And I let it move through without trying to name a villain. And in that space, I felt something that I hadn't felt in a while. And it was relief. Because when we stop feeding the feeling with more thought, it stops running our life. You know, we don't need to fight our feelings. We just need to stop giving them the mic. We feel it, we breathe through it, and we move forward clean. Now, shift 3 is all about rewiring. When you stop feeding the emotion with more story, you quiet the storm. And from that quiet, you begin to rewire. Not just what you feel, but what you believe about who you are. And so every thought we repeat is a vote for who we're becoming. And most people are voting for a version of themselves they don't even want to be anymore. You know, I'm always behind. I never get this right. This is just who I am. And those aren't facts, those are patterns. I worked with a founder who told me, you know, I hate that I second guess everything. And we had a long conversation. We traced it back to one moment in childhood where he made a mistake and he got humiliated in front of an entire group. And the story that he created was, if I'm wrong, I'm not safe. That one moment wired an identity that he had been practicing for over 25 years. The shift, he didn't need to erase the thought, he just needed to stop rehearsing it. So rewiring doesn't mean pretending, it just means choosing what you practice. One new thought repeated with presence, anchored with action, that's how the new wiring sticks. Now, shift 4. Shift 4 is visualization. When you stop rehearsing the past, then you make space for something new. But that new identity, it doesn't come from thinking differently, it comes from feeling differently. And that's where visualization begins. You know, you're not waiting for clarity. You're waiting to feel like the version of you who already has it. Visualization isn't about seeing, it's about feeling. Because the brain doesn't respond to just images, it responds to chemistry. And when you vividly rehearse the energy of you, of who you want to be, your body begins to believe it's real. One of my clients started doing just one thing every morning. Before checking anything, he visualized himself walking through the day calmly and confidently. And within weeks, his schedule hadn't changed, but his presence had. And because his presence shifted, so did his results. You know, you don't wait to feel better, you feel better. And then your life catches up. And that's the power of visualization. Not to wish for the future, but to embody it now. Shift 5. Shift 5 is inspired action. Once you feel the future version of you, you're not meant to just imagine them. You're meant to move like them. And that's where we close, with action. But it's not just any action, it's inspired action. Awareness without action is just insight. Insight without alignment is just noise. Inspired action doesn't mean giant leaps. It means consistent steps from the grounded version of you who's already at peace. I had a moment recently where I almost said yes to something that definitely was not aligned. And at first it looked right, it sounded right, but my body said no. And I caught myself asking myself, am I saying yes from pressure or peace? And when I asked that question, I paused, I breathed, I connected to my breath, and I waited until the future version of me responded. And that's who said no. And it was the right decision. So the goal isn't to act more, it's to act from the version of you that already knows, that future version of you. So the 5 shifts that we walked through was awareness, emotional mastery, rewiring, visualization, and inspired action. And so that's 5 shifts that lead to 1 return. If this spoke to something that you've been carrying, if it gave you clarity, calmness, or something to breathe deeper into, then I'd love for you to share in the comments below, or send this to someone who's been leading from pressure but is ready to return to presence. Because we don't need more force. We need more people remembering who they truly are. Because it's not about changing who you are. It's about becoming who you're meant to be. And that version of you is already waiting